The initial, I can't remember how to pronounce his first name now, Genko Yokoi was the inventor of it. But what he did was the Game & Watch had been fun, but you could only play one game, so the longevity of the system wasn't very long because you'd get used to playing that game and you'd stop doing it. And so he wanted to create a interchangeable gaming system that was handheld, and they came up with Game Boy to do that. And I'll never forget we had a gentleman that we knew, and I don't know if you want to quote names, but he said, "Hey, I found this game in Russia called Tetris. You guys ought to go check it out because it's a really unique game." And so the very next day they jumped on a plane and flew to Russia and signed a deal to get the rights for Tetris. And we came in and packed it in, and that was a brilliant move for the launch of that hardware because it was a game that literally anybody could pick up and play. It wasn't gender specific or age specific, and it was addictive, and I think that was the key reason why Game Boy took off the way it did.
And of course, no discussion of classic games, I think, would be complete without the Nintendo Game Boy. I grew up in a world and came of age at a time when the Nintendo Game Boy was state of the art, and you may as well have had a fusion reactor in your pocket for the magic that was the Game Boy. I have played thousands of hours of Tetris on the Game Boy, and that was how I spent almost all of my high school years. I had all these ridiculous accessories, like magnifying screens that had lights built into them so I could play in the back seat of the car when my parents were driving us places, and external battery packs. And I was on a series at the time, so I could afford to get 2 Game Boys, so my friends and I would play head-to-head Tetris all the time. I mean, it's amazing that our entire generation doesn't have carpal tunnel syndrome in our thumbs from playing the Game Boy.
My first console that I actually owned to myself was a Game Boy Pocket, and that thing was a pretty sweet rig back in the day. Let's see, I played a lot of Game Boy games, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance.
I remember when the first Game Boy came out, and I was like, wow, this is really awesome. You could play Super Mario Brothers, and it kind of looks like the Nintendo, but it's just black and white.
When I got into the IGN, the Game Boy Color came out, and Pokemon was one of the biggest games on there, and no one was covering that game. So that's where I found my passion, was just kind of like looking at the handheld and seeing how I could, cover the system that no one else was doing.
I guess it would have to be, I always had like the old gray Game Boy, and there was like Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. It was all in that green and black looking color, and it was a lot of fun.
Well, I kind of grew up with Game Boy. That was the only system I was ever really allowed to have in a conservative family, was Game Boy. And that was basically to shut us up in the car while we went on family vacations, was the green and black screen of death. So I was playing that tons, like original Super Mario Brothers on there, Tetris. I think there were a couple battleship games that just kept me occupied, and I wouldn't talk so it wouldn't bother my mom or dad.
So when I first got started in game audio, of course we were working on NES and PC sound cards and the Game Boy. The challenge back then was not to necessarily create music and compose music, but to get it to sound like something. So you could write a song in a day, but it might take you 2 weeks to get it to sound like the way you wanted it to sound like. Of course, the limitations back then were all about how many voices you had. So, for example, something like a Game Boy had 3 PSG voices, which were basically just 3 kind of sine waves and whatever, and it had 1 kind of white noise channel that you could use for percussion.
I think one of the fondest memories of Game Boy was when I first got a game, the cartridge of Pokemon, and I looked at the graphics and I thought, no one's going to want to play this. This is crazy. And then I stayed up all night playing it because it just grabbed you and sucked you into that game. It was incredibly addictive.